Hi, everybody. This is Kendall from Sager Family Farm. And today we're going to do our Big Buzz About Bees lesson. So this is all about the honeybees that we have on our farm. If you have any questions for me, I'll get to them at the end, but you can type them in over here. Only I can see your questions. So feel free to ask whatever you want about bees. And I will also be asking you some questions. And when it's time to answer some questions, I'll point it out down here. A little poll will pop up that you can answer my questions about bees. So I think everybody here has probably seen a honeybee before. If you think about walking around outside, we usually see bees outside somewhere. And when I see bees, I usually see them kind of like this. Let me show you a video of a bee that I took just a little bit ago. So I was on a walk through our neighborhood and I saw a honeybee on a plant. And she definitely seems really interested in these flowers. And she's putting her face into each flower. And does anybody know what she's doing? What is that bee collecting? And I just asked you a question over here, so you can answer it down in this part of the screen, is what was that bee doing? And I'm going to play that video again so we can take a good look at her and what she's doing. So over here, she's definitely going from flower to flower. I'll give you a hint. She has her tongue out. So her tongue is out and she's sticking it into each flower and she is collecting something from the plant. And I've got a slide that's actually a close-up of her tongue. So over here, we can see our bee is sticking her tongue out, and let me highlight where her tongue is. So her tongue is this part right here. So she's got it in this liquid over here. So there's some liquid right here that she's collecting, and she's sucking it up with her tongue. And her tongue has a really special name, and it's called a proboscis. So this is the same sort of tongue that a butterfly has because they both drink the same thing out of the flowers. And it looks like a lot of folks have answered. So what is that bee collecting? The choices were honey, nectar, and flowers. It looks like nobody thinks she's collecting flowers, but we're a little split between nectar and honey. So this bee is actually drinking nectar from flowers. And later, when she brings that home from the flowers and brings it back to her beehive, she dries the nectar out. Nectar is really watery. It's actually a lot like juice. So it's sweet like juice, but if I had it in a cup, it would slosh around. Whereas honey is really thick and sticky. So the bee actually has to dry the nectar out to turn it into honey. So you're sort of right by saying honey because nectar is like pre-honey. So it will later turn into honey. So you're really close with the answer of honey. So there is also another thing that bees are collecting from flowers. And I've got another video of some bees that I saw just the other day when it was nice and sunny out. And so here is a rosemary plant. And this bee, if I take a close look at her, she has something on her back legs. So this bee is collecting something different from the flowers. So she's not collecting nectar. She's collecting something else. So I'm going to ask you guys another question over here in the bottom corner is what is this bee collecting? So it certainly looks pretty dusty and it looks like she's getting it off of a special part of the plant. So let's take a look at that video one more time just to take a look. So she's getting something, it's pretty dusty, and she's getting it off of the anthers of the plant. So she's not sticking her face deep into the flower. She's kind of like using her front legs to kind of brush something off. And it looks like everybody has said that this little bee is a pollen collector. And that is totally correct. This bee is collecting pollen. And I have another question for you because we know what nectar turns into. Nectar turns into honey. But what is this bee doing with the pollen? So why does she collect pollen? Is she going to eat it? Is she going to make honey with it? Or is she just going to smell it? So I'm going to show you a slide of the bee close up collecting pollen. So over here, we've got the bee collecting pollen. And here on her back legs, we see a big ball of the pollen. But on her whole body, she's covered in these tiny little hairs. So she's got these tiny little hairs all over her body, and you can see the yellow dust all over her. And this is actually how she collects the pollen. So she's using her front claws and she's getting all dusty, but her front claws have these special hairs on them. They're kind of like hairbrushes. And she combs the pollen out of her hair and packs it onto a special hair on her back leg. So on her back leg, she has one really long hair called a pollen basket. So it's just one hair though. It's not a basket of hairs. It's just one really long hair, and she wraps the pollen around it kind of like cotton candy on a stick. And she's taking it home. And let's see what everyone thinks that she's going to do with it. Some people think she smells it, and she does smell it. She smells a lot of things in her environment, and that helps her know which plants to go to, what is the tastiest. So she is kind of smelling it, but that's not her main goal. So our other options were eat it and make it into honey. So make it into honey, that's not far off. So the nectar turns into honey, but the pollen is not turned into honey. So, but she's doing the same thing with the pollen that she does with honey. Ultimately, she eats the honey, and she also eats the pollen. So inside of the beehive, the bee is collecting this pollen, she's bringing it back, and then she packs it down and mixes it with nectar and actually a little bit of honey to turn it into bread. So this bee is actually making her own bread that we like to call bee bread. And this bee bread is fed to the young baby bees that are growing up inside of the hive. So the bees actually eat the bee bread. So they're actually collecting pollen in order to eat it. So these bees, they are all going back to their house. And in the wild, the bees might live in houses like this. So over here, this beehive is actually on a tree branch. So they just built all of this honeycomb. So the white stuff here, so you can see it in these sheets. That is the honeycomb. And that the bees built that. So that's their house, and it's hanging down from the tree branch, which is going across the top up here. And then we can all see each of these little guys. Each of those is a bee. So there's tons of bees all around over here. And over on the other side, so on this side here, this is actually a beehive that I found in an owl box. So this is a box that kind of like a big birdhouse that would be a house for an owl. But the bees found it and it was empty, so they decided to make their house inside the owl box. So they can build their houses just about anywhere. And I want you guys to take a guess. Both of these beehives are kind of small. So I'll show you one more picture before you have to answer this question. But I wanted to ask you guys over here is how many bees do you think could live in one beehive? And let me show you a picture of a bigger beehive. So over here, these are actually beehives in one of the backyards that I keep honeybees in. And this beehive on the very end is as tall as I am. So this is about a 5-foot tall beehive. So this one is much taller than me. This one is probably about 6 feet tall. So those are big beehives. So how many bees do you think could live in those beehives? So we've got a few people saying 600 bees. It is actually way more than 600 bees. We have a few people saying 6,000 bees, and that is a lot of bees, but it's actually more than 6,000 bees. So in this one beehive right here, there could be up to 60,000 bees. That's usually about the maximum number of bees we could have in a beehive. So even though the other beehives are bigger, the bees are probably just a little more spread out. So we could have up to 60,000 bees in one beehive. So that is quite a lot of bees. So let's go back, and I've got some more videos for you guys. So let me turn off my whiteboard and let me show you how I open some of these beehives if we wanted to see some of the insides. So the first step for me opening these beehives is to actually use some special tools. So the first tool that I'm going to use is actually something that I wear. So I have a bee suit. So this bee suit helps protect me when I'm around the bees. As you can see, I'm standing right next to my beehives and the bees are kind of flying around, so I'm quite calm around the bees. And the bee suit has a hat on it. The part that covers my face is called the veil. So the part that covers my face is really important. And another way we could look at this, so another version of this is actually just a hat with a veil on it. So you can just wear this. And the reason why we always wear a veil is because there's a lot of bees coming back and forth. And if I wasn't wearing this and a bee bonked into my face, that might be kind of scary. So if you've got a bug on your face, you might be a little scared. And when you're scared, you might not be able to act as calm and still as you should around bees. You might start waving your hands. And this actually scares the bees because the bees, they're only this big and I'm huge compared to the little bees. So they don't think that I'm scared of them. They actually think that I've come to attack them and that I might eat them because bees have a lot of predators. A lot of people think of bears like to open beehives and eat the honey. They actually prefer to eat baby bees. Luckily, I don't have any bears in my backyard, but I do still have a lot of predators. So there could be raccoons, skunks, rats, or even ants can really bother the bees and try to eat what's inside. So if I start hitting bees in the air by waving my hands, the bees might think I'm another predator. And if they think I'm a predator, they might sting me to make me go away. The bees don't want to sting me though. They can only sting once in their whole life. After they sting, they die. So that's the end of their life. So if I can remain really calm and the bees don't think I'm a predator, then they're less likely to sting me. Because the bees, they don't want to die. So if I put down my veil, I cover up my face, and if I cover up my skin, if I'm scared of bees crawling on me, you should wear long sleeves and gloves. Or some beekeepers just open their beehives with their bare hands because if a bee crawls on them, they can remain really calm. So the bees definitely don't want to hurt us. The other tool that I always use when I'm opening my beehive is this one. So this one is called a smoker. So the smoker is it's a tool that we use to keep the bees calm. So this tool, I fill it up with dry leaves and pine needles, and then I'm going to start a tiny little fire in here. And once the fire is started, there will be smoke. So I can close the lid of the smoker, and the part that I'm squeezing now in the video is the bellows. So as I squeeze the bellows, air goes through and makes the fire bigger and makes smoke come out the tip. And the smoke isn't hot. I don't want to burn the bees, so I can actually blow the smoke on my hands. It's totally fine. And before I open my beehive, I puff a tiny bit of smoke into the entrance. So here I have an empty beehive here with me. And before I would open a beehive, this is their entrance where the bees would come and go, is this little slat right here. So I'd puff just a tiny bit of smoke in there to help keep the bees calm. And that's kind of strange. Why would puffing smoke on bees help keep them calm? And I'll give you a hint. It's because bees don't talk to each other the same way that we talk to each other. So if I said, hey bees, don't worry, I'm your friend, that's not going to calm them down because they do not understand me. So I need to tell them in a way that will keep them really, really calm. So I have another question for you guys, and that is, how do bees communicate? So over here, bees use a different sense than we do to communicate with each other. So you guys are using your sense of hearing right now, so you're listening to the words that I'm saying, and that's how we're communicating. But bees communicate differently. So they are not using hearing, so that's a hint for over here. It's not hearing, but they're either using sight, smell, touch, or taste. And it might have something to do with how they might interpret the smoke. So how would they notice the smoke? Would they see it, smell it, taste it, touch it, or hear it? So I'll give you a hint. I don't think we can hear smoke. So it's definitely not hearing. And touching smoke, I can't really feel smoke. So it's not their sense of touch. So I'm tasting it. I don't think I can really taste smoke either. So we're down to either sight or smell. And sight is pretty close. So sight, we can definitely see smoke. But if we think even harder about how the bees live, so they're inside of a beehive, or sometimes they're inside of dark tree trunks. So it's very dark inside of the hive. So they might not use their sense of seeing quite as much because it's so dark in there. So they're actually using their sense of smell. That is fantastic. A lot of you guessed sense of smell. So smoke has a really strong smell to it. And bees talk to each other by smelling each other. And I want to show you guys another picture of a little bee over here. So here we have a honeybee, and it looks like she is collecting some pollen. But if we take a close look at her, does anybody see a stinger on this bee? And the answer is there is actually no stinger in this picture. So the stinger would come out right about here. So the stinger would be on the end of the bee's body. But this bee is really calm. So her stinger is actually inside of her body. And if she gets scared, boop, it'll pop out. So her stinger would pop out right there if she got scared. And she would actually probably put her butt in the air to kind of warn the other bees. And so when her stinger comes out, there's actually a smell that's released. And this smell is a lot like if I was scared and I screamed or I gasped. So I went, oh! I warn the people around me that maybe something scary is going to happen. So other people around me might get scared because I'm acting scared and making noises like I'm scared. So this bee, if she gets her stinger out and there's a puff of a smell, all of the bees sitting around her smell that. And now they get a little scared, and then boop, they pop out their stingers. And then all of the bees around them smell that. And so they get out their stingers, and pretty soon the whole hive has their stingers out, ready to defend. But my smoker, when I use the smoke inside of the beehive, it's kind of like telling the bees, shh, because it covers up all of the smells in the beehive. So I do actually stop them from working quite as well together, but I'm also stopping them from telling each other that they're scared. So if I puff a little smoke in my beehive and then one of my bees gets scared and makes the scary smell, none of the other bees smell it because the smoke is covering it up. So they keep doing their jobs. And then when that bee realizes that none of the other bees are scared, she calms down and puts her stinger away. So that is why I always use my smoker, is the smoker helps keep my bees calm. And the bee suit helps keep me calm. And so once I've got those two tools ready, I can open my beehive. So to open my beehive, here's a video of me opening one of my beehives. So I've got my bee suit on, and I have my smoker in my hand, and I have to go around to the front of the beehive and puff the smoke in the front. So the bees are all coming out the front, and I'm standing at the back. And then I can open the lid of the beehive. So that's the cover. and that helps keep all of the rain out. So then there's another cover, and I'm actually using another tool called a hive tool, and it helps me pry apart all of the sticky parts of the beehive. And I can then open the beehive. And so here is where all of my bees live, inside of the beehive. So we can see them all crawling around in there. And inside of the beehive, there are 3 castes of bee. And here are the 3 castes of bee. So they all look a little bit different. But let's focus on the bee at the bottom right now. So the bee at the bottom, this bee, there's only one of her in the entire beehive. She's very important. So I bet a few of you know what her name is. So think it in your head, or you can say it out loud to your parents. But this bee is the queen bee. So the queen bee, she actually only does one job inside of the beehive. And I'm going to ask you guys what it is. So in just a second, right over here, now you can answer, what is the queen's job? Does she tell the other bees what to do? Does she take care of the babies? Or does she lay eggs? So she only does one job in the whole beehive. And this bee, she's a pretty important bee. And her job is not done by any other bee in the beehive. This bee also lives the longest of all of my bees. So the queen bee can live for up to 5 years. Most of the other bees in the beehive only live for 6 weeks. So 6 weeks, that's a little over 1 month, whereas the queen bee can live for 5 years. So it looks like a few of us are guessing, and no one guessed. Oh wait, just a few people guessed that she tells the other bees what to do. And the queen bee actually doesn't tell the other bees what to do. If we had a human queen, she would probably tell all of her subjects what to do. So she'd be bossing us around. But the queen bee, even though she's a really important bee, she does not boss around the other bees. The other bees actually boss her around. So they tell her what to do. And let's see, a few people guessed she takes care of babies. So this queen bee, there are 60,000 bees in that beehive. So there are a lot of babies. So she doesn't take care of the babies, but she is in charge of laying eggs. So if you guessed she lays eggs, that is correct. This bee is so good at laying eggs. She could actually lay 2,000 eggs every day. So she is very good at laying eggs. So 2,000 babies every single day. And that means in the entire beehive with 60,000 bees in it, they are all her children. So they're all her children. So this bee probably needs a lot of help from the other bees. So let's take a look at some of the other bees in the beehive. So we know who the queen is now. And now let's take a closer look at the bee at the top here. So, oops, my bad. So the bee at the top here. So the bee at the top is the worker bee. So this worker bee does all of the chores in the beehive. So this one is the one that takes care of the babies. They collect all the food from the flowers. So they're collecting nectar and pollen. They clean the beehive. They even guard the beehive. So these bees are doing a lot of different jobs. And I have another question for you, because a lot of people don't know this. Are worker bees boys or girls? So are the workers boys or girls? They're only one. So they're either all boys or all girls. And while we're thinking about whether they're boys or girls, we can take a look at, because I skipped over showing you guys what the queen's eggs looked like. So let's go back a little bit. So the queen, when she's laying eggs, she goes into the honeycomb and she lays these little eggs, and they look like kind of like a grain of rice. So here's one of them. Here's another one. So you can see these white lines standing up in the bottom of the cell. And these are the eggs. So the queen actually walks around the entire hive laying eggs. So she doesn't stay in one spot and all the eggs are moved. She actually goes one by one and lays an egg in each hole. And these eggs are actually super tiny. They are smaller than a grain of rice, about 1/3 the size of a grain of rice. So they're really hard to see. So this is a very close-up picture of them. A lot of beekeepers have a lot of trouble seeing them. So let's go back and see. Let's see, we're about 50-50 split on whether we think the worker bees are boys or girls. And the worker bees are all girls, every single one of them. So it's the girls that collect all the food, they take care of their little sisters, they clean the beehive, they even guard the beehive. So the boys are not in charge of guarding, it's the girls who are in charge of guarding the beehive. So every single worker bee is a girl. And that's why I actually use the pronoun she a lot, is because when I see bees on flowers, I say, oh, she is collecting nectar. She's collecting pollen. That's because I know that's a worker bee's job, and all worker bees are girls. So when you see a bee on a flower, you know that that's a girl bee. So let's take a look at the last bee, and we can kind of guess who this is, because if we think about the other bees, the queen bee is a girl. The worker bees, they're all girls. So we're missing somebody. And this bee in the middle is a boy, and his name is a drone. So we call all boys drones. So if we take a look at all of these bees, so what is the drone bee's job? And it has a lot to do with how his body is different than the other bees. So let's take a look at all three of these bees and try to see some ways that they might be different. So bees have three parts of their body. So there's the front part right here, which they all seem to have, is the head. The middle part is the thorax. So that's where all the bees' legs are connected to, and the wings. So usually there's a lot of transportation happening on the thorax. And then the last part is the abdomen. So if we take a look at the head and the thorax of the queen bee and the head and the thorax of the worker bee, they actually look pretty similar. So they're kind of fuzzy, they're about the same size. But then when we look at the abdomen of each of these bees, the abdomen for the queen is much larger. The abdomen is where she stores all of her eggs. So she's got a very large tummy. So her abdomen is really big. Now let's take a look at this drone bee. He looks pretty different than the girls. So his whole body is a little bit bigger. His thorax looks bigger, his abdomen looks bigger, but not longer like the queen's. It's kind of short and fat. So he's a stocky guy. He looks like a football player or something like that. He's kind of a big guy. And one thing in particular that I notice is his face. Look at those eyes. Those big black things are his eyes. They take up almost his entire face. And this is actually what his job is. His job has to do with seeing things. So his job is to fly around outside of the hive looking for queen bees. So he's looking for queen bees to help them lay eggs. So the queen bee lays the eggs, the drones help her lay the eggs, and the worker bees do every single other chore. So they are doing a lot of things. So let's take a look at what some of these things look like inside the hive. So if we opened up the hive, and actually let me show you, if I open this little hive right here, some of the pieces that we're going to see. Again, there's no bees in here because we're inside my house, in my office. And I try to minimize the number of bees in my house. It doesn't always work. Some of them sneak in because I do have, 3 beehives in the backyard. So well over 100,000 bees hanging out in my backyard. So every so often one hitches a ride on my shoulder and comes inside. But inside of this beehive that has no bees in it, It's filled with frames. So this thing is a frame, and this is where the bees build their honeycomb. So they build it right in here. And bees, like we saw in the first few pictures I showed you, bees don't need to build their comb in here. They're really good at building comb. They could build it on a tree, in a house, in a birdhouse, wherever they want. But I want them to build it in here because honeycomb is really delicate. And if I grabbed it with my hands, I would probably break it. So I like them to build it in these nice strong wooden frames so that I can pick the pieces up and look at them and then put them back in my beehive without breaking them. Let's see, I think I've got one that's got some honeycomb on it. So this one, let's see, it's been poked a few times, but this is what it looks like when the bees have built their honeycomb in it. So they've built all of these little holes ready to accept food and babies. So they can store pretty much anything in these little holes. And these holes, let's see if I can get a little closer and you can see the shape of them. So this is a very special six-sided shape. And try to think of all of our shapes that we know right now, is what is a shape with 6 sides? And what are these bees building? And we'll have to just think this answer. So I don't have a poll for you over here, but the answer is a hexagon. So the bees are building all of these little hexagons. And if we looked at these inside of the hive of what they're filling all this stuff with, let's take a look at this video. So I opened up one of my beehives, and first thing I see a bunch of worker bees crawling around on top of this honeycomb. And then I also see some colorful stuff inside of some of the holes, some bright yellow, some light green. So some of these little hexagons have some really colorful stuff in them. That is actually the bee bread. So let's take another look at that video. So I'll play that one another time so we can take a look at it again. So the bee bread, it's the pollen off of their back legs and it's smashed into those little holes. Some of the holes look like they have something really shiny in them. I can see that little bright white where the light is bouncing off of something really shiny inside. And that is the nectar. So this frame of honeycomb has bee bread and nectar in it. So this is the food from the bees. And it also has a bunch of worker bees all on top. So let's take a look at, I was looking through my beehive, and now I found the queen bee. And if you look super closely into some of the holes, I think I'm moving around too much, but there's actually eggs in some of the holes underneath her. They're really, really hard to see. But the queen bee is the bee with the green mark on her back. And the green mark is not natural. It is actually paint. So I actually took a marker or a paint pen and I colored that mark on her back. And that is so that we could find her a little bit more easily. But it also tells me what year this queen was born, because she could live for up to 5 years. So I use 5 different colored pens. So this year I'm going to be marking all of my bees with a blue pen. Last year, I was marking all of my bees with a green pen. So I know that queen bee is about 1 year old right now. If I see a queen bee with a red mark on her, I know she's 2 years old. So this is telling me how old my queen bees are. So it helps me take some notes in my beehive. So let's take another look in there if we were looking for a drone bee. So over here, we've got a drone bee. He's hanging out right in the middle. See if you can spot him. He's got big eyes and he's bigger than all of the other worker bees around him. So he's right in the middle, kind of walking around, and his face is almost all black because of his big eyes. So these bees, they can be a little hard to see sometimes. And then the last thing that I wanted to show you guys is the life cycle of the bees. So if we're looking at eggs, larvae, and cocoons. So the worker bees right now, they're actually standing over top of a bunch of holes that are covered up. And those are actually cocoons. Next to it, there's kind of these white grubby looking things. those are the larvae that are now kind of at the edge of the screen. And if you look straight into some of these holes, there's a faint white line, and those are the eggs. So let's watch this video one more time. And I also have some pictures of this if it's tricky to see in the video. But the reason why the worker bees are kind of standing near the cocoons and the larvae, actually one bee even stuck her head in with the larvae, is because it's the worker bee's job to feed their baby sisters. So now we're looking at the eggs. So the eggs are there in some of those holes. It's a faint white line. So the queen, we're still waiting for those ones to hatch, but the queen stuck her abdomen in there and laid an egg. So let's look. I've got some still pictures of this so we can see it just a little bit better. So the life cycle of the bees, the queen comes and she lays an egg. And we can take a look over here. So this is the egg right here. So there's eggs over on this side. And then on the other side, these are the larvae. So this life cycle is actually a lot like a butterfly life cycle. So the mama butterfly lays an egg on a plant where the egg hatches. So the queen bee, she sticks her abdomen into a hole, lays an egg, and then it hatches into a little larva. So these larvae are sitting in food. So that white milky stuff is actually food. When the babies are really young, they're fed something called royal jelly. It's kind of like the milk of the beehive, and that's what they're sitting in. But then they get switched to eating bee bread a little bit later. So the worker bees come, they feed them, they feed them, they feed them until these larvae get really big and fat. And so here we can see some really big larvae sitting in some of these holes. And then some of the other holes, like these ones, are covered, and these are the cocoons. So just like a butterfly, the egg hatches, it's a caterpillar, and then it goes into a cocoon or a chrysalis, and it starts to transform into a full-size butterfly. So same thing with the bees, is they've got an egg, they have the little larvae that eats lots of food, and then in the cocoon, the bee is transforming. So it's actually going through metamorphosis as well. So it's going through metamorphosis, and it's transforming into a full-size bee. And the worker bees, they're pretty smart. So if we look at this frame over here, we can actually see that there are the babies over here. So all of the babies in cocoons are over on that side. And then we've got this ring right here of bee bread. So there's actually food right next to the babies. So the worker bees don't have to walk very far. So they get the food and they bring it to the babies. And then these coverings over here look a little bit different. So the coverings over on the far side are actually honey. So we can see that the coverings look a little lighter. It almost looks a little see-through, so a little translucent. I can almost see what's underneath. So that's honey. And then the ones I can't see through in the middle are the cocoons. So that is actually what I've got for us today for our big buzz about bees. So we saw all where my bees lived and all their different jobs inside, and even learned about their life cycle. And now if you have any questions for me about bees, you can type them over here and then I will answer them. So let's see. Oh, and someone says, sometimes we see big black bees. What type of bee are they and what do they do? So that's really interesting. I have some extra photos of things. So let me bring up one of my extra photos, because there are actually lots of different types of bees out there. So we've got honeybees, which we talked all about today. There's some social bees, like bumblebees, so they still live in a nest, but nowhere near as big as the honeybee colonies. And then on the side, I think my picture is blocking it. So let me move up here. So these ones are solitary bees. So the big black bees are solitary bees called carpenter bees. So they're usually pretty shiny, they're huge. So these carpenter bees, they're actually bees, they're pollinators. They are solitary bees. So they live all by themselves. So that means that these bees have just a few babies each. The reason why they're called carpenter bees is they burrow holes into wood. So they make their house inside of wood. So that's what those big black bees are. And actually, before I answer more questions, because it looks like there are more questions, is let me put a poll up for what we should talk about next week. So next week on Tuesday, I'm going to do an update on our baby chicks. They'll be 1 week old, so we'll see how much they grew. But on Thursday, I want to know, do you want to do an exploring the garden class where we're going to talk about all the parts of a plant and all the parts of a plant that we eat? Or do you want to learn more about bee products and how honey is harvested? So you can let me know in my question over here while I answer some more of your questions. So let's see. In what amount of time will honey be ready to eat? So it really depends on how big my beehives are. So if I have a really big beehive with 60,000 bees in it, and they're all working really hard, and there is a nectar flow on. So a nectar flow would be when there is a bunch of flowers blooming. So it's starting to be springtime in a lot of parts in the United States here. So in California, we've had springtime for a little while now, at least on and off with rain. So with all that rain and the warm weather coming, all these flowers are starting to bloom. And so there's a lot of nectar to start coming in. So if I have a big, strong beehive, they can actually go from an empty frame like this to one of these. Let's see. Oh, this one's very heavy. This one is filled with honey. So this is about 5 pounds of honey in here, or that's about 5 of these jars inside of this one frame. They can make one of these in as little as 2 weeks. They could actually make 10 of these in as little as 2 weeks if they are really strong and there's a lot of flowers. So bees are working really hard. But one of the interesting things about honey is that the bees only make, each bee can only make 1/12 of a teaspoon. So only a few drops of honey in her entire life. So that's 6 weeks long. But when they all work together, they can make 100 of these jars every year. So they can make 100 pounds of honey every year when they share their chores and work together as a team. Let's see. Oh, and someone asked me, are all of the other bees princesses? And I like to think of the bees as princesses. So there's one queen bee, and all of the other girl bees, since they're daughters of the queen, I like to think of them as princesses, and all of the boys are princes. So there is no king bee. All of the boy bees that are inside one beehive are usually the sons of the queen bee that lives there. So that's why he has to go out and search for different queen bees, because the queen bee in here is his mom. So that's why we don't have a king bee, because the king bees would all be up in the air. So there's no king bee, only a queen. So one more question of how many hives do I have? So I usually keep in the order of 30 beehives. So they are not all in my backyard because I have a very small backyard. So it might get a little crazy back there with too many beehives. So I have 3 beehives in my own backyard. And then I also keep bees in other people's backyards. I also keep them on the roof of a library. So if you're in the San Francisco Bay Area, my bees live on the roof of the Redwood City Library. And I also keep bees at an orchard called Philoli. So Philoli has a lot of other things, but that is also in the San Francisco Bay Area, a beautiful garden estate to go and visit. So I keep bees all over the place. And they are very happy because everyone around here plants such beautiful blooming flowers for them to eat. I've got one more question is, how many types of bees are there? So there are actually in the entire world about 20,000 different species of bee. Most of them are solitary bees. So that means they live all by themselves. So most of them are solitary. As for honey producing bees, we have 0 native honey producing bees here in the United States. So my honeybees are actually from Europe. So most of the bees here kept in the United States, and honestly, a lot of other countries, are European honeybees from Italy, Russia, all over the place in Europe. So that's where our bees are from, because no native bees in the United States produce honey. And I love having my bees. My bees are such wonderful, sweet little creatures. So they're very friendly. Not everything that flies around and stings is a bee. So the bees are usually the most gentle creatures, because after they sting, they die. So I really love my bees and get attached to them. And one more question is it true that eating local honey, so honey produced in your area, can help you with allergies? So there's not a lot of scientific proof on this just yet, so hopefully there will be some more studies. But it is in line with other allergy treatments. So if I was to go get an allergy shot, they would take a little bit of the thing that I'm allergic to and give me a shot. In the honey, the idea is that there's actually a little bit of the pollen in the honey that you're getting. So that's why you usually look for raw, unfiltered honey, is because there's more pollen in here. And if you are allergic to something, then you're eating small doses of it. So we don't know how much to eat in order to help our allergies. And it's also really hard to test. So for local honey, we're usually making it in very small batches. So it's hard to test exactly how much of the pollen is in our honey. If I was allergic to grasses, bees don't pollinate grass. So honey is not going to help with my grass allergy. But if I'm allergic to some, like a lot of the wildflowers around here that the bees really like to eat, then anecdotally, there are actually a lot of people that say that this really helps them. So unfortunately, there's not like a scientific paper I can point you to, but it's in line with a lot of allergy treatments. So hopefully we get some other things like that. So I think that just about wraps it up for today. And if you have any other questions, your parents can send me an email, or you can comment. You can contact me on Facebook or Instagram. Thank you so much for coming. Oh, wait, I have to look at the results of our poll. Is what should we do next week? And the answer is we are going to be looking at bee products and how honey is harvested. No one wants to look at my garden. Well, actually, there are some people who want to look at my garden. So I'll get to you. I think in 2 weeks, I'll probably do my garden class no matter what. But next week, we'll take a look at how honey is harvested and all of the different things I can get from my beehive. Thank you so much for tuning in, and see you next time. Bye.